Hello and welcome to the Columbus Metropolitan Club. I'm Steve Marks. I'm the chair of the CMC Board of Trustees and president of Hannah News Service here in Columbus. It's great to see everyone here today. Today, CMC is pleased to present Middle Class and the Fading American Dream, sponsored by the OSU Alliance for the American Dream, represented here by many friends and associates. Won't you please help me thank them? Working at a job that keeps your family comfortable enough to own a home, have reliable transportation, and access to affordable health care were once attainable goals of the middle class. As we look around the country today, we see more and more Americans being squeezed by the rising costs of the same things that once felt rightfully within reach. And one expected expense can bring it all tumbling down. What is required to achieve and retain middle class status, and why, in today's America, it is so hard for so many to get there. Please join me in welcoming our speakers today. We have Associate Vice President for External Relations and Advocacy at the Ohio State University Wexner Medical Center and Health Sciences Colleges, Jennifer Carlson. Project Manager of Power of Home at the John Glenn College of Public Affairs, Michael Pyrus. The new Executive Director of the Ohio Public Transit Association, Laura Kaprowski. And our host, Professor of Economic Development at the Ohio State University's John Glenn College of Public Affairs and the College of Engineering's Ohio Manufacturing Institute, Ned Hill. Ned, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve, and thank you, everybody, for joining us today. I'm wondering if you'd do me a favor. If you've got a piece of paper or a pen handy, just pull it on out. I'm just going to ask you to write down a couple answers to questions, not to be public about it, but to help you think about our topic today. First thing I want you to do is just write down as to whether you consider yourself to be a member of the middle class or not. You've got low-income people, working-income people, middle class, and upper income, upper class. Where do you fit there? Where do you perceive yourself to be? And I'm going to give you, in a few minutes, a chance to understand why I'm asking you that question. So just put down quickly, where do you think you are and your family is right now? The second question is a little different. And I just want you to think about it a little bit. How do you know if your kid has made it as a member of the middle class? It's not necessarily income. But what are those markers of movement? And then if you're like me and you've got a 30-year-old child, luckily she's up and moving well and has been off the payroll for years, what would be the indicators that I got to worry? And as a parent, I can't interfere. So we're just going to leave that out there because that will help get your head into the issues we're talking about today. Now I'm going to do a little setup, and then we're going to do the panel for quick little pieces on their issues. Then the idea is that we will have time to talk back and forth with each other. So if we're talking about the issue of America's middle class, it is truly a wicked problem. And I don't mean wicked by the term evil. Wicked by hard. It's hard to define, it's hard to understand, and the big levels of expense and uncertainty and risk are all over the place, and we can be petrified if we try to solve it in one big gulp. But understand that if anyone has a silver bullet solution, they're lying. The second thing about the middle class, which is really about this topic, which is important, and this goes back to that very first question I asked, is the range of dollars. If you're a family of 3 in the middle class, you're middle class in Ohio if your family income is between $40,000 a year and $121,000 a year before taxes. And one of the things that we find out with the polling in the middle class is 90% of Americans think they're in the middle class, when indeed the size of the middle class as a fraction of society has dropped by 10 percentage points since 1971. And it's only 51% of Americans are actually in households that are part of the middle class. So that's the number side. The second question could be answered if I'm going to steal something from Gene Krebs, so you know he's in the room. Gene told me about a focus group or a hearing that he was at in Columbiana County a few years ago. And this person stood up, obviously a working background, and he said, I don't ask for much out of life. I want the ability to have a good used truck, a good trailer to live in, my kids to have a good education, 2 weeks vacation, and retire on something other than Social Security. And that instantly said that this is more than money. And when we did focus groups with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Ohio, the Glenn College did a piece on Oregon that you can find on our website. Our partners in Colorado just released theirs. There's another one coming out from Nebraska. The numbers didn't make the issue of middle class of the people we talked to. It was all in their hearts. It was in their souls. And they asked the same thing. Middle class, I kind of want some control over what happens to my community, my neighborhood, my main street. And in Marion, that disappeared, even though there are good jobs there. And I also want to make certain my kids are well educated. I don't have to worry about health care, that my retirement is more than Social Security, and I make a difference in my community. Interest in community and income came together. And the other last point I'm going to put up as a setup and then turn it over to the panelists is that increasingly people are giving up on government as a way of trying to deal with this issue. There's movement to try to fix incomes through minimum wage legislation, as to try to talk about living wage as opposed to living income. The ability of government to redistribute income through service provision or tax policy is being left to the side of the road. All of this makes the problem harder, makes it more wicked. So what I'm going to ask the panelists to do is I'm going to do by areas of concern. The largest area of concern that we heard was health care. So I'm going to ask Jennifer to go first. The second area of concern we heard a lot was, oh yeah, I forgot about owning a house was in the Marion issues, was housing. So Michael will come second. And then we're hearing more and more about not just transportation, but mobility. And that's Laura. So Jennifer, take it away.
Well, thank you. I appreciate being here, and we can all agree that healthcare is on the top of our minds. It certainly is for my family of 4. But I did want to level set and say that today my remarks are going to be less focused on those individuals who actually can afford healthcare and less focused on those government-sponsored plans that are the Medicaid, the Medicare plans, but really focused on the middle class and what they're purchasing and some of the challenges that they have. And so, to steal another quote, I did want to start out in saying, you know, one of my favorite American authors is Mark Twain, and he popularized a saying in saying there's lies, damn lies, and statistics. So I'm going to use a lot of statistics to help round out the details here on why healthcare is challenging and it's complex. So back in 2015, the Kaiser Family Foundation study found that most American workers, their deductibles, it's not your premiums, it's your deductibles and co-payments, rose by over 67%. In that study, the Kaiser Family Foundation also found that 8% of your gross income for those workers, that was being invested in health care. Now, roll the clock forward, we're sitting at 11%. And so the challenge is the median gross income for workers, those American workers, that inflationary factor, their growth in wages hasn't kept pace with the growth of rate of those deductibles and those co-payments. So we've got a challenge here. There's significant pressure within budgets for the American families. And so I did want to take a closer look about here what we're doing in Ohio. So the middle class, as it was defined, we're facing with about 44.7% of the population in Ohio is defined as middle class. And you can define it using the range that was described between $44,000 and $120,000 per year. So if you were to take an example of a population, a family of four, earning $65,000 a year, and that's gross income, which equates to about $5,364 a month, they have to pay for health care. And that family plan is about $6,000 a year. So it's a little over a month of their wages. So imagine this. Imagine if this family of four is faced with a catastrophic situation, a terrible situation where the mother is working part-time, the father now has been diagnosed with cancer, a terrible outlook. He's faced with a deductible of $2,000 to have access to the best treatment. He also is faced with a $500 copay for pharmaceutical drugs. These are specialty drugs that he's going to be reliant upon for the rest of his life. So that 11% factor that we talked about now equates to 20% of that family's disposable income. That's gross income. Right. So that's a fifth of their income. And so we're also faced potentially as a family of four that they're making hard choices. Is the mother going in for their well checkups? How are they paying? How are they affording that health care? Are they using credit cards to pay for what they need to have access for? Are they accruing bad debt? You know, one of the biggest concerns that we know around personal bankruptcy is health care expenditures. So that's a concern. So in adding all of this up, we also know, statistically speaking, and this is according to Forbes magazine, that 62% of Americans can't even pay for an unexpected bill of $500. So I think about people like Nick Carlson, who's my guest today, my son. He's not a family yet, he's a part of our family, but how do we prepare and protect individuals in moving forward that they know how to manage, they know what they're stepping in. And I really appreciate being part of this conversation, this community conversation, where hopefully we can bring businesses and healthcare providers, consumers together to pull apart this national problem.
Thank you. Michael, self-housing.
Yeah, let me first start by sharing a little bit of my story, my perception of what the middle class means. Ned opened up with the conversation and wanted you guys to say what the middle class meant and what it meant for the generation that follows after you. It's true that the middle class is often defined by income, but I would like to say that we could also define it by our life experiences. So for me, as a first-generation immigrant, homeownership was something that was first and foremost on the minds of individuals that are coming here and migrating from different countries. I associate the middle class with working class or small business owners as a result of that. The idea that a person has access to affordable housing, transportation, health care, those are in fact opportunities to achieving social mobility, as well as true equality of opportunity. So with the middle class, that's the symbol for sustainability, for security, for shared prosperity, and for wealth building. So homeownership and housing. Oftentimes, homeownership is the gateway to the middle class, right? I mean, that's what we've been told for forever. This allows low-income, middle-income families to build economic security and to invest in their community. Each year, about 1 million low to moderate income families obtain homeownership through an affordable mortgage program like ones that are being offered by the Ohio Housing Finance Agency or Freddie Mac or Fannie Mae that you probably have heard of as well. Persistent gaps in wealth and homeownership among minority and low-income households are what drove these programs like down payment assistance to encourage homeownership. The rates, as I mentioned, are increasing each year as the market recovers from the economic recession. And here in Ohio, we have seen a 50% increase in homeownership rates from the previous year. So 2019 saw 50% increase from the previous year. And that's 200% greater than what it was in 2015. So we're doing a fantastic job putting low to moderate income families in affordable opportunities where they can acquire wealth and build upon social economic mobility. However, our research shows that about half of these homeowners in Ohio that are purchasing through these affordable home mortgage programs have incomes that are below 80% AMI. And they have about $1,200 in savings total. This puts them in pretty vulnerable state. These homeowners also tend to purchase households that are older because it's what they can afford. And on average, the median age for a house is 1960, and 25% is over 1950. Further research indicates that 50% of these households are going to experience a home repair that's going to amount in at least $2,000 in the first 2 years of home ownership. These characteristics put homeowners at a high risk of financial hardship in the early years of home ownership. So let me equate this into a story that we often told in our proposal for the Power of Home project. It's a real story. It's a real story about a homeowner, and by definition, she fits into the middle class, but she is at risk of fading out of the middle class. Her name is Andrea. She's a single mom. She's 29. She purchased a home through Ohio Housing Finance Agency's HEROES program because she's a nurse. She finished her technical degree and received a certified nurse's aide. She earns about $40,000, $45,000 a year, so she's right in that middle class. After she bought a home, 18 months afterwards, her furnace breaks. She now has a bill for $3,500 to replace this furnace. She knew that the likelihood of a furnace replacement was going to happen. She bought a house that was 20 years old, but she has limited savings. So she often has to make the decision is, how am I going to pay for this? Am I going to put this on an expensive credit card? Which in fact she did. She's struggling to pay that debt off now, 2 years even later after the fact. She has to make decisions about, do I pay for our car this month? Do I pay for housing? Or do I pay for something else? So these households are truly on the edge of the middle class, Ned. One furnace away or 2 weeks away from unemployment or missing work represent the difference between living in the American dream or waking up in a nightmare. So because real disposable incomes for the middle class have not grown since the middle of the last decade, and that's coupled with rising costs of healthcare, education, transportation, the shrinking of the middle class in the example that I provided could be tied to a liquidity issue.
Laura, onto mobility.
Yes, onto mobility.
But we aren't going to talk about income mobility.
No, we're going to talk about actually transportation mobility. So not to really continue kind of the doom and gloom, but I think to give the full picture of the fragility of the middle class, those aspiring for the middle class, those to stay in the middle class, just add $10,000 to their annual bill. That's what it is just to own, maintain, and fuel one car. But most families want two, right? And they have the child who needs to get to their job as well. So maybe they're trying to have 3 or 4 vehicles. And just as Michael said, with one furnace away from being in financial ruin, really just one car away from financial ruin. Currently, there is close to 10% of Americans are behind their car payments by 90 days. And that's pretty alarming when you start adding up what Jennifer has said, what Michael has said, and now what I'm sharing. And I think to layer onto that the mobility discussion that, Ned, you brought brought up is it's really a cultural feeling of being in the middle class. And I would say in the Midwest, part of being in the middle class is aspiring to have a car and aspiring to choose your home, where you want to live. And so this idea that, you know, that we are going to make choices to be car less, car light, use public transportation, it's not just, I mean, if you look at the numbers, it's easy, it makes sense, but we're really tackling a cultural issue and some norms, and we're having to come to terms to something that the millennials understand. You know, I can say goodbye to that car. I can choose to live in a smaller place and remove that expense. But it's something that the rest of the middle class or those aspiring really need to, we need to make it a much more normal and acceptable choice for us. And I will say the positive news is transit ridership is increasing. The last quarter, third quarter of 2019, the American Public Transit Association saw an uptick across the country of 2.2% in ridership. COTA here has had ever since its transit system redesign has seen an increase in its ridership numbers as well. And so that speaks to if you have fast, frequent, convenient transit service, you're going to draw riders. And actually that, and along with that, though, we have to keep in mind, okay, so what does the middle class, what draws them to public transportation? Because again, you know, we are looking at, I aspire to have a car, public transportation, you know, what does that mean? What is it like? So just finally, I would wrap up that transit is very much a rural issue as well. So think about middle class grandma who is becoming increasingly isolated. She's had a good life, or grandpa, great life with car, and they're in the middle class. Now they can't drive, and they've never used public transportation. Again, it comes back to these cultural norms. I was just up in the Cleveland area last week, visited Lake County, Lake Tran. Out of their 100 vehicles, 90 vehicles are for trips for seniors and paratrans, or those with disabilities or physical challenges. So to think about a suburban county like Lake County outside Cleveland has found its niche and its market, and their community's responding. They just had an increase in their sales tax so that they can expand and meet the need of an aging population. So those are kind of, I think, you know, two sides of the coin. It's a very important issue that we transportation mobility can definitely draw people down from the middle class, prevent them, but I think there's some really positive silver linings as well.
So listening to this conversation, if I were you folks, I'd be trying to say, should we just jump out the window now or get it on over with? But there are a couple things that I think we should keep in mind, and I'll be asking the panel about this in a second. The first thing is some of the numbers clearly are driven by the baby boom generation going into retirement, still having wealth, but less income. So that's driving some of this. We're also seeing the millennial generation coming in, and they're in the early stages of their work life, and they're going to earn more as they go forward. So the market's going to work to a certain extent there. But the other thing that I heard in each of these presentations was this notion of, if we define it as opposed to how can we bring people up in their income generally, which sounds like massive redistribution, which isn't going to work, or how can we change markets and opportunities to lower risk and to deal with different portions of this. Now, I'll tell you this one thing about Laura's presentation. We mentioned this before. When I was doing some work out in Seattle, we got great mobility and transit polling. We found out there was overwhelming support for public transit in Seattle. And when you got to the questions of why were they supporting public transit, it was so that someone else could take the bus to make it easier for them to drive. So that's an important thing. So actually what I'd like you to do in a few minutes there is kind of, what are ways of reshaping the question or reshaping markets that we should be thinking of? Or what are pragmatic ways to provide optimistic solutions? So let's start with transit. Go the other way around.
Go the other way? Okay. I think one way to solve the issue, so getting to a job is your gateway to financial prosperity, and if we're talking about the middle class, to stay in the middle class. Oftentimes, it's about you can use transit, but it can take too long, or it's that first last mile gap. Yep. So really what we are seeing in the transit industry, mobility industry, is filling that gap, what we call micro-transit, or again, back to that first mile, last mile. It's being filled by public transportation, COTA Plus right here in Grove City, which can get to people from the last COTA stop to several of the job centers in Grove City. But we're also seeing it as a way to start new businesses with Empower Bus and Share. So very exciting. However, I would say a caution about this working is that the businesses and work sites, the employers have to be a participant. And that has been hot and cold. And just a couple examples here, positive. We have the Great Workforce Shuttle in Rickenbacker, been going on successfully since 2015. It is funded and in partnership by COTA, OBETS, and Groveport. Those are the financial and supportive partners. And then conversely, think about Chariot. If you remember that was basically a microtransit kind of operation by Ford getting into the mobility service. And I know I rode a route once just to see what it was like, and it was going up to Westerville to a major employer complex there, and they couldn't keep it going. So I think those...
Buy a beater, beat Ford.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's going to take some trial and error for sure, but I think solving that gap is going to be critical, because I think we're going to have to be pairing up these modes to get people to where they go. I mean, there are reasons why there are jobs in suburbs, even in the rural areas. Sometimes they're light manufacturing, they're distribution, Amazon. They frankly need that space, and that's where those buildings are built. But we have to do a better job and be committed to making those connections happen and not let that be an island unto itself.
And I think what you also were hinting at is that the problem has to transfer from being a social problem to being a problem of the sustainability of the business itself. It becomes a workforce problem.
Yes, and we talked about this earlier about, businesses think about, I've got to keep my parking lot paved. I got to get the potholes out. All right, I'm going to have to invest in a parking garage. I think that this is something new for them. We need to also, as businesses, employers, think about the full range of mobility options, just like downtown CPAS. You're all in.
Terrific. Michael, we know the basic blocking and tackling of lowering cost of housing means denser, smaller, but are there other things that are involved? So one of the examples, and the concern, particularly in Columbus, since it's growing so rapidly, is can we look 5 to 10 years down the road so we don't end up being like San Jose? So what else is what else is there that can use the market in ways that gives us a gateway to a solution?
If I really truly had the answer to that question, I may be more successful in my efforts. But you're right. I mean, it's not necessarily just a doom and gloom. With housing, it's all about two words for me. It's affordability and sustainability. So as we work to provide affordable options for people, whether it's home ownership or whether it's renting, and by the way, here in Ohio, just like 31 other states nationwide, it costs less to be a homeowner than it does to be a renter, and that's on average of about $200 a month. But rentals can be a very good option for people. I just became a homeowner at the age of 41 years old, so So I truly enjoyed being a renter, and I think we need to create more opportunities for renters and affordability. So on one hand, in terms of affordability, continue to advocate policies, programs from the federal government as well as from private companies that provide flexible affording options like 30-year mortgages, 15-year mortgages, sustain those products and promote those products to low to moderate income families, and then provide support systems for those after purchase or for those that are currently renting. So again, we do a great job of putting people into homes, but what do we do after the fact? They're often left to figure out this gamut of community resources and rebates and incentives, whether they're related to reducing energy costs or whether they're related to reducing housing costs in general. So continue to advocate, continue to be on the front lines of policy discussions related to affordability, and promote programs that sustain borrowers long term.
Terrific. I actually looked to Queen Elizabeth for the answer. Isn't that an interesting place to go? Turns out that the largest landowner in the United Kingdom is the royal family. And one of the things that's interesting in Great Britain, mostly to support the historical monarchy, is they've separated land costs from building costs. So land is owned by the monarchy, and you can own the building. And one of the things when it comes to affordable housing, it's actually the land cost that goes up. And a community which is proactive and looking down the road actually could go in the market and start buying up lots of land and holding that, because that's the part of the inflation in the marketplace that you can have some control over, and then doing rents or ownership on top of that land.
Yeah, there's some good examples of community land trusts, and I'm more familiar with those in Northeast Ohio, up in Cleveland. And there's some really good examples, also from a homeownership standpoint, but from a rental standpoint. And so they're maintaining ownership of that land for 99 years and maintaining affordability. So for the next family that occupies that space, whether it be, again, a rental or affordability housing, you know, it's a shared prosperity there. They're going to make it affordable for the next family. And so and
the logo could be a couple corgis.
Yeah, you know, especially in neighborhoods that are kind of, quote unquote gentrifying. You know, it's an opportunity to create permanent affordable housing. And so, you know, we often deal with affordable housing, but it's not permanent. And the use of a land trust, community land trust, can be a good solution for permanent affordability.
So I'm instructed now at this point in time is give you your 5 minutes notice. So we'll turn the floor over to you at about 1 o'clock. So if you have some questions or thoughts, there are microphones set up where? Right? Everyone knows where they are. Good. We don't. And we'll be back to you in a few minutes. So Laura's got a follow-up comment, and then we'll give Jennifer the last few minutes.
Well, actually a question, because, I mean, the housing and transportation are so interconnected. And so I'm curious, I mean, not to steal your role, not as the moderator, but I'd love to hear from Michael, I mean, just your thoughts and experience, I mean, how those can be better integrated. And so there's not that spatial mismatch where, you know, bus stop is 2 miles away. Yeah,
bridging the gap with different modes of transportation, right, outside of busing and the scooters. So you're bridging the gap between the workforce that lives in MSAs and communities and have access to be able to affordable housing and transportation outside of the cities. Because
by the way, that's not a baby boomer friendly solution. You don't want a clown like me with my size coming down at you with a scooter. But
yeah, and it's costly. If you go past a mile, go past a mile, it's like a couple of dollars, $5, I think, once you hit a mile or something. But yeah, I mean, building, again, bridging that gap, creating infrastructures that support, innovative transportation modes that connect the workforce to the suburbs is extremely important, especially in a city like Columbus that's growing and creating this, racial and economic disparities that we have here in the city.
Right. So now's a good time to start lining up as I asked Jennifer to think a bit about where she sees solutions coming in the healthcare space. I also want to pitch the fact that on, I think it's February 11th, at the Glenn College, there's a dialogue. It's going to be down at the Gateway Film Center on, is Medicare for All the answer? And I think Greg Moody's also doing a research seminar Monday at 12:30 at the college. So you've got a couple opportunities to follow up on the healthcare discussion.
Great. So when you look at healthcare expenditures, we know that a lot of the commercial plans that you can buy, they look real attractive to families because they're not cost out too high. But what consumers aren't pulling apart are the unknown variables, the deductibles. So going back to that case where if you have a catastrophic event, are you saving money to be able to have access to affordable care? So I do think that there needs to be more of a focus around financial literacy. Consumers need to understand what they're buying. We need to have a focus more on consumer-directed health care and, quite frankly, have employers incentivize their employees to start doing things that will help them prevent getting to that catastrophic event. So in that regard, it could be, your smoking cessation services, making sure you're going to your wellness checkups, exercise medicine. I mean, there's lots of best practices that, at Ohio State we've been doing, and we're investing a lot around social determinants of health. So going back to transportation is incredibly important to these consumers, that if they're not on the bus route coming down to Ohio State trying to get to McCampbell Hall, well, that's an access issue. There's certainly a lot that healthcare providers, we all have been working to try to figure out how do you bend the cost curve, because the bills that the consumers aren't paying, that's hitting our bottom line. And we're seeing a huge amount of uncollectible debt growing within healthcare. So how can we work in hand with consumers to make them more aware of we're providing easier access to care 24/7 through not only urgent care, but you can go for your wellness checkups, or if something were to emerge, there's easier ways to receive that care. We have electronic medical records where consumers can ask questions to their providers to avoid having to schedule their doctor's appointments. And so the list goes on and on and on. And so there needs to be perhaps a better conversation with the employer community and the healthcare community, putting together, we've talked about this, Ohio State is on the top 4 of employers in the state of Ohio. And, banding together and sharing those best practices with other employers, I think that might be a start of the solution in bending that cost curve.
Fabulous. Well, we've got some people lining up. It's kind of like the friends and family group starting to form over there. And so the only caution I have is we'd appreciate if these are questions rather than statements. And if they have anything to do with the presidential campaign, I'll shut you off right away, because this is where real solutions are going to take place. All right, Kimberly, introduce yourself and ask a question.
Kimberly Gibson, it's a pleasure to be here with all of you. Thank you for your comments. And Jennifer started going where I was going to go with my questioning is, we heard Ned set us up to say that people don't believe government is increasingly part of the solution. Maybe government's the problem. So there's that mindset out there. I would like you to talk about the role of government and the role of the private sector. Jennifer, you did a little bit of that. I'd like you to go a little deeper on that and how you see those two sides of the civic coin communicating on these problems.
Sure. If you don't mind, let's take a step back to the Affordable Care Act. And I think most of you are familiar with how what the federal government did. They authorized and the state agreed to extending the Medicaid benefit. And so we now have more covered lives who are insured, and that creates more healthier economies of scale in the communities. At Ohio State, it certainly closed the uncollectible debt, and it provided more access. That major piece of legislation, while not perfect, I certainly have a short list of recommendations on more things. For example, there is making insurance more affordable. There's a family coverage glitch. So an individual can go on the open market to buy insurance, but family members do not have access to what was set up within the Affordable Care Act. So that's something that government can partner with. You know, there's also narrow networks. So some of these insurance plans on the open market say, okay, you need to go to divine employer or places for your care, but it might not be the best place of care. You want to make sure that you've got major academic medical centers, as an example, in those plans. Because if not, you know, I get concerned about individuals that are in rural America, where they have rural community settings, where they don't have the ability to hire major, you know, researchers or providers. And so there's certainly things that we can do on the national level to fix that. There's certainly ways that we can do to, you know, encourage employers to have plans put into place to incentivize their employees to take charge of their care.
So if I'm going to try to do something unusual for me, which is a short answer. The first thing is it's important for government to understand the role of markets. And it's critical for government to protect effective markets. It's really important that government put up a set of guide rails around it to make certain that functioning competitive markets don't become monopolized. And in all these areas, we're dealing with market failures, and just saying, oh, let the market go without understanding what a functioning market is a problem. The last thing is the political expedient answer. There's pressure from the left to mandate a solution, to fix the market, whether it's a wage price or other things. And on the right, there seems to be an increasing emphasis on protecting the endangered species, which is failing industries and failing companies. And in doing that, they make it harder for markets to work. We need a radical middle that understands the way markets work to make certain that markets work for consumers and work for taxpayers, rather than by those that can rig markets. But outside of that, I don't have an opinion. So, Bill, do you want to come up next?
Here, here.
And introduce yourself. We know you don't understand markets.
Probably less than people think. But my question's probably one for you, Ned. I came upon a really troubling study a few years back that Columbus is one of the least economically mobile regions in the country. And so my question is, how do we work on fixing that? I know the Schmidt Futures work is targeted towards that, but what are some ideas out there that might bring more people into the middle class?
That's a great question, and I'm going to give you an answer that you probably won't expect. One is, I don't believe the research. When Richard Florida came in town and said that we were the community that's growing the fastest in inequality, I looked up the numbers, and it turned out that we're actually in the list of the top 5 most equal metropolitan areas in the United States. I think he read the freaking table upside down. The second thing is, as the state of Ohio, if you look at the Gini coefficient, we're one of the more equal states in the nation. And I mentioned this to a former governor who said, well, how can that be true? I said, well, that's because we have fewer very rich people here. That former governor's assumption was, well, then we should lower taxes to 0 for them and keep them here, because he thought that all rich people were heat-seeking geezers going to Florida or Phoenix. And I didn't point out to him those are just his friends. And when you look at the data, Ohio's problem is that we don't have enough inequality because we don't have enough rich people. We don't have enough rich people because of taxes or heat-seeking geezers, is that we aren't growing enough new businesses. Very rich people are made by starting new firms, new industries, and that's part of what's happened in the coast. They are unequal because of their growing billionaires. Now, they're leaving California. They're going to Incline Village in Nevada. They've got this terrible gentrification problem in Incline Village. The billionaires are pushing the poor millionaires the hell out. But so what it really means, and part of what Ohio has to do, is keep on reloading and working hard to reload that economic base. We got that. That's absolutely essential as we're doing that. So defining the issue right is correct. And those heat-seeking geezers are going to go to Florida anyway, even without the tax differential, because they're heat-seeking geezers. So anyway, I have difficulty with states whose state insect should be a palmetto bug, which is essentially a cockroach on steroids, and takes barbed wire, paints it green, and calls it grass. So outside of that, I just lost all my consulting income from Florida, but that's all right.
Thanks for saving a little time. I'm Steve Weiler, and my question is for Laura, and it's about free code of service, and if that's being researched, or what the status is of that issue.
So I'll talk about free transit in general from a statewide perspective and national. So I appreciate the question. I'd be surprised if we didn't get it, because I know it's being widely discussed here, but interestingly, it is a big issue across the whole country. And so Kansas City just recently said, we're going to be free transit as a city transit system. Meanwhile, in St. Louis, they said no. And I think there are a lot of systems across the country seeing, is it all one, all free, or is it a different variation? In the city of Boston, they're looking at one of their major congested corridors, just making that BRT, those transit lines free. So I think that it is something that needs to be looked at, this is me personally, as a strategy, but you have to also weigh the benefits. Like downtown CPAS here in Columbus has been extremely successful, underwritten by the property owners as well as businesses and employers in the downtown area. But we're talking about the middle class, and remember, middle class has cultural norms, and oftentimes they very much like, I'd love to ride light rail. So that's the kind of public transportation they're aspiring to get on in the service. That takes resources. So having conversations with transit industry leaders when you go free, and you're a growing region like Columbus, or I wonder Kansas City is, how do you continue to expand the service, and how do you make sure that service is something that's going to draw middle class and upper middle class? Those are not easy answers, and so it really requires a lot more, I think, in-depth discussion, and it's certainly going to require participation from the private sector to really make that successful, because otherwise you're going to have free transit, but you may have buses breaking down, you may have trash, you also may have safety issues.
Okay, we'll try to do short answers. We're bad at this.
My question is for Michael Pyers. Why can't we think out of the box a little bit about other than single family house or home ownership? I mean, it used to be you had grandma or grandpa live with a family, you had 3 generations under one roof, and you had more than one type of income coming in. I've worked with an awful lot of single women in my life, often with a child, and I've always thought, why can't 2 of you get together and buy a house together? You've got 2 people then watching the kids, and boy, would I love to share cooking responsibilities with somebody else. But I've always thought, why is it everybody wants their own little house? It may not necessarily be that practical anymore.
I completely agree. I mean, I'll keep the answer short, but I too grew up in the same type of environment that you did. So I don't know what the answer of that is, but there are creative housing options that are out there. Some are being mostly done on the coast, like with shipping containers and tiny homes. And I think you mentioned something else as well too, but that I can't forget, that I can't remember. But But the topic of
I'm famous for saying things that can't be remembered. That's good.
you know,
I have students.
to get young people to live in a closed environment isn't necessarily a problem, but the topic of aging in place is something that's important to me. And so thinking about aging seniors and those that are living in these single-family houses that are very large, I talked about the upkeep of these homes and the ongoing maintenance that's required of this. We should look to transition them into a different type of housing. Something that can allow them to age in place, maybe something that's a ranch level, something that's smaller, maybe a condo, something like that. So I'm
going to ask us to keep it short. We've got 2 more questions and 3 more minutes.
I'll leave it at that. There should be some creative options, and I'd love to work on some of those.
Hello, Max Peoples. I'm a guest today. Thank you very much. Great presentation. You mentioned middle income, $40,000, $124,000 gross before taxes, et cetera, and point out housing affordability and stuff for somebody 40, 50, 60,000. So my question is it worth taking a look at the federal income tax and restructuring the brackets? So let's say, to be provocative, the first $100,000 has no federal income tax. All of a sudden, you've put several $1,000s back into the pocketbook, the spending pocketbook of that person. So that $44,000 wage earner just picked up $3 grand. She just afforded her furnace.
I'll take moderator's privilege and jump in first, because I have an opinion here. Surprise. The first thing we have to be worried about is the fact that we've screwed around with the tax structure in this country enough that our deficits are becoming incredibly large. The right and the left completely agree that we should have services that nobody should pay for, and hope that China will keep on giving us money so we can afford to do it. So the first thing is that we actually have to get back to a sense of fiscal responsibility so that we do not end up with 5, 10 years down the road some very serious macroeconomic problems that hurts growth. Second thing is, yes, the bracket we should pay attention to it, but I'd also say that we should make certain that all taxes are considered taxes. So when you hear people talk about low-income people don't pay any taxes because they don't pay income taxes, they're paying a higher marginal tax rate because of FICA taxes. So cash is cash. Personally, if I were king, I would get rid of all corporate income taxes, but make certain that everyone pays that as cash. But that's a long discussion. So one more quick one, and I'll try to be short.
Hello, I'm Cynthia Jones with Drive Ohio, and my question had to do with something Jennifer mentioned about financial education. So I have 2 high school freshmen. How do you teach children and people as they grow how to spend money responsible? So you spend it on transportation, you spend it on housing, you spend it on everything, and how much should be Starbucks? So what's a good method that we could maybe engage in the community on financial education?
Jennifer?
You want me to take that? So I'm going to point to my son over there, who's a freshman at The Ohio State University, and it speaks to family mentorship. You really have to educate your kids early on the value of the dollar and how your dollars are being spent and how you're saving as a family so that they understand what it all means. That's my suggestion.
And oftentimes we provide financial assistance or financial literacy services for those that are trying to achieve home ownership, but oftentimes they can be late in the game, right? So let's start at a much earlier standpoint, right, with mentors and things like that.
And I'm starting to think that Gene Smith should be here to tell us what he does with the athletes, because he covers this quite well. But Laura.
I would say if you're going to do driver's ed, it should be actually all modes so that you have a full understanding of how to use transit, you know how to maybe ride a scooter, and you know how to drive a car. And then you can make that financial choice, what works for you.
Thank you so much.
Great. I hope you found today's forum not too depressing. It is an important topic, and I think we had some great panelists that shared some thought-provoking ideas. So let's thank our sponsor, OSU Alliance for the American Dream. And also our speakers, Dr. Ned Hill, Jennifer Carlson, Michael Pyrus, and Laura Kaprosky. And our special thanks to all of you. Hope to see you next week.